Welcome, friends, in Lokayat Conversations. And our esteemed guest today is Mr. Bruce Moore, formerly director of the International Land Coalition for nearly 10 years between 1998 to 2008. Prior to that, Bruce has been working with numerous organizations. He was a UN diplomat and has been the board of Transparency International in the Institute for Global Food Security at the McGill University. He is now based in Canada and is working with various civil society organizations on the issues of concern, particularly such as transparency, corruption, democracy, hunger, food security, land rights. Prior to being director of the International Land Coalition, he, between 1973 to 1998, he was a director of a Canadian organization called Partners in Rural Development.
Well, thank you, VB. It's a pleasure to be here, because I think those of us that would like to see the future of our world and of our communities, of our villages, different than if they've been through much of our livelihood, welcome the opportunity to exchange some of our views. At this stage of my life, I'm not interested in my story, but I am interested in the message, because the struggles that we're facing, including today due to the pandemic, but more so, I believe, because of the way that democracy is failing us in so many countries, the expectations after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as if liberal democracy was going to be the way forward, has not proven to be the case at all. We know of the 1%, and we know that the gap has been getting wider. And therefore, the populist movement is not something that just started in the past 4 years as we think about the United States, but has been mounting for a long period of time. And activists like you, myself, and so many thousands upon thousands of activists around the world have been pointing out that this level of growing inequality is neither sustainable and it's morally unacceptable. And so I welcome the chance to be here. But for those who are listening to this, we also welcome this because it's a matter that we have to work together with people all over the world of all backgrounds. And in many ways, thank you for this invitation, because of course, during the short time I was with the International Land Coalition, you and your organization, SDF, were one of the first organizations that we were able to reach out to and start to work with. So it's a pleasure that this interview is occurring probably some 20 years since you and I first met.
Yes, Bruce, it's nearly more than that actually, because I met you, I think, in 1997, 98, when the coalition has not been formed. So since then, it has been a great journey. We are speaking at a moment when your neighbor, you are witnessing a regime change, and the 4 years, as you mentioned yourself, have been very, for some people, very traumatic. More than 400,000 people died in the United States, unprecedented, I would say, out of COVID-19. And there have been, world over the last 4 years, so the growth of the religious rights, political rights, where the minorities became unwanted, the marginalized were pushed to more margins. How do you now visualize the situation in America and your country? Is this change in the government? What is the message that you have at this moment?
Well, certainly we in Canada are very concerned because we live under the shadow of the United States. We've not only had tried to figure out how to survive the Trump period, but that has always been the case. Because as much as we and our government and our private sector have expanded international trade relations from an economic point of view, we are still at least 70% dependent upon the United States. And increasingly, as our economy has gone through its various peaks and valleys, we have had a lot of our businesses bought out by American companies. But I'd also tie this into the expansion of the Chinese. And we've had massive discussions, public discussions, and concerns with interests in the Chinese wish to buy up a lot of our natural resources. Because for people who think about Canada, very often people don't think that we are fundamentally have two parts to our economy. One is an export of natural resources, much of which is exported in a raw material fashion. It's not processed here, so we do not get the normal value added. The other is we are an economy of small businesses. People think about our oil and our other minerals, but in fact, if we look at where people are employed, a lot of them are employed in small businesses. And at this point in time, there's a great concern about how the trade relations will develop with the United States. Today, we're told at the close of the inauguration of the many bills that the new president will sign will be to cancel a major pipeline, and that is very concerning to Western Canada. For some of us who feel that our country has not seriously undertaken to invest in getting off of fossil fuels, we of course don't see that as a bad thing. We understand it will be painful for workers, but Canada has to practice what it's preaching with regard to the Paris Agreement. And one of the hard things is going to be to diversify away from fossil fuels. However, the relation with the United States, the fact that they're going to be signed in to cancel a major pipeline is an indication that the US is perhaps going to push us to look at these issues in ways we have not so far. Therefore, the whole matter of what is our relationship going to be remains to be a bit of a question. However, we are likewise very concerned about how the behavior of the US is affecting the way in which China is moving into spaces that they have ignored for some period of time. I've been talking to colleagues in some parts of Africa in the last few days, and one of them, a former colleague from my NGO days in Canada, who does a lot of work and supports work in South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, but more on the relief side, have pointed out the effect of the withdrawal by the United States from the World Health Organization, and their supply chain of the things they need to work in villages came to an abrupt halt. The Chinese soon thereafter moved in to occupy that space. This comment is not to open up a discussion on this interview about China, but it's to say the geopolitics of the United States, which used to be the Cold War, seems to be being supplanted by the geopolitics of the United States and China. But because of the way the United States has performed and behaved in the last few years with regard to multilateralism and these kinds of factors, causes many of us to be concerned that we're going to lose sometimes the balance that is needed between these superpowers. And now we have China not necessarily being adequately balanced by a countervailing force unless the new president does something to restore relations at the global level and rebuild relationships that have been damaged.
Yeah, that's true. So, unlike United States, Canada has dealt with the whole issue of pandemic, I suppose, in a much better way. How has been life in Canada during this last 1 year during the COVID-19, and who were the most affected people?
Well, the affected cases have been the elderly, the older people, probably in the 65, 70-year age category and above. And there's been great concern. Largely, it's been for those older people who are living in supportive housing or in some of our, might say, long-term care facilities where we've seen the largest outbreaks initially. On the other hand, perhaps like elsewhere, we're seeing a growing number of cases among those people that are much, much younger, like in their 20s, those who are not following the guidelines of our government to adequately distance, not go out into various gatherings, and that is being somewhat ignored. And that has brought about, generally speaking, a lockdown across the country because of the nature of being a federation and not like other countries. Our federal government can only go so far, and it relies upon the provinces to adapt, and therefore there's some variation, but our numbers are still quite high. In different provinces, they're coming up, but they're going down and up and down. So getting it under control is proving to be quite difficult. And although Canada has tried to order many doses of the new vaccine, it looks as though we're going to be delayed in receiving them. On the other hand, I'm very proud that our Prime Minister has seen the way to say that we've ordered, if we were to receive all of the vaccines that our government has ordered, it would be more than we would likely need. And the idea of sharing, and I think this brings us to something that underpins any of us who've worked globally, that is the issue of equity. It doesn't do us any good to get everybody vaccinated in parts of the world, but if we don't get them vaccinated in all parts of the world, then we're all remain vulnerable. And it's like the development agenda. If we don't deal with development everywhere, it's a problem everywhere. We can't isolate ourselves from this. And the COVID experience, I think, and hopefully if we see something positive coming out of it, then what we will see is that the global approach to trying to develop vaccines, if it's followed by a global approach to sharing access to the vaccines, hopefully that will carry over into how we look at taking a more globalized approach to
Yes.
other development issues.
Yeah, that's true, Bruce. But this has also exposed some people say Western hypocrisy, or the hypocrisy of the powerful countries who have ordered all the vaccines in advance. UK has ordered large, Canada has ordered much more than its population deserve, and other European Union, United States. So even the UN Secretary General is actually speaking about that, that all countries should be vaccinated, and powerful countries, rich countries must allow this vaccination drive to go to the poorer countries also, because this is showing the gap between the rich and the poor countries.
Yes, I think I was being a little bit idealistic in what I said a few moments ago, because certainly that is the case, and that well, even in our case, Canada has been speaking along the lines that I mentioned. On the other hand, I think it was the president of South Africa who spoke with our prime minister asking for a decision that Canada would share vaccines with their country. And from the media reports, there was a rather political dodging of that question by our prime minister. So I think I agree with you that this is really playing itself out as a continuation of the the approach of look after ourselves first and then others, which is classical of the whole approach to development over the past many years. So this I would say is something we have to speak out, and we people like myself have to speak out with our own government.
Yeah, because there is another crisis that happened, that is happening or that is unfolding in the third world countries or developing countries, is the impact of the lockdown. Because here death may not be in comparison to the Western world, where we saw the very large number of people dying. There is little evidence of those kind of deaths in Africa or even in Asia. But what is happening here is the impact, the economic impact of the lockdown. So people might die of hunger in the coming days, and there will be more death due to poverty and malnutrition than due to COVID. So do you think that the COVID controversy or COVID whole narrative has been hijacked by the powerful corporations, so that government focuses on those things, and the other agenda of the development is diluted?
I don't feel that I'm the person who has the best authority to speak on or best information about the particulars of this of the corporations. But I would say that the indications, even from what you said a few moments ago, is that we do have what's commonly called elite capture. And that at the end of the day, we also have the concern that for democratically elected populations, including our own, which we're proud to think of ourselves as a democracy, our political systems are highly influenced by the lobbies of the commercial, private sector all of the time, not just at this particular time. So I don't think we have, if we, instead of saying, can I comment upon what is specifically happening with Pfizer, Moderna and stuff like that, I cannot. But I don't have any reason to believe that anything is changing in the behaviors whereby these large corporations are having the influence you're talking about. If we were to sort of move from that situation to others, people like you and I that have worked in development for our entire lives have seen the effects of how the World Trade Organization and the Davos meetings, et cetera, bring the corporate elite together, that have fostered the acceleration over the past number of years of globalization, which is clearly seen by those who do research and those of us who've worked on the ground, to have brought about the 1% problem, because the gap has been growing. And this has been a reflection of the corporation's ability to characterize and to suggest that the only way to solve the problems of development, hunger, poverty, health issues, improving education, dealing with endemic health issues, is through a corporate approach. And this economic model is something that is starting to become more exposed in recent months and in the last few years than it had been. And this is where a lot of the citizen movements around the world have started to expose the fact that this economic model is not working. And therefore, there's no reason to believe that the favored access by the rich countries to these vaccines is going to be any different than that.
Yeah, because what has happened is that when the pandemic started, many of us felt that time it is time for the governments world over to focus on the public expenditure on health particularly, and on the education. So the need was that the government has to turn into a welfare state, which is like an abuse in the United States. If you talk about socialism, it looks like you are a Al-Qaeda person or they call you communist, just because they don't like the term socialism. Last 1 year, we have seen the governments have turned very authoritarian, using the people's, pushing, people into fear, and, under the garb of that fear, they have used all methods. So these are the democratic governments who have used this pandemic as an opportunity for themselves to push for the more corporate friendly agenda. And now people have realized many parts of the world, and they are coming up in the streets, so they don't care now whether this pandemic is growing or not growing, but people are in the streets. How do you react to this?
Well, I think that I react with grave concern. I see, for example, people on the street in my own country. Less than a kilometer from where we're speaking today is the India High Commission. There are placards in front of the High Commission that are standing up and expressing the concern for the laws that are being proposed, or perhaps they've already passed in India, that's going to drastically compromise the smallholder farmers across your country. And so I think in all of these cases, citizens are trying to respond. And therefore, for a person such as myself, you don't do this kind of work for your whole life. And because you are no longer employed, you continue as volunteers on boards of directors. I've been given many opportunities to do that. But on the other hand, it is something that is different when you're not involved full time to have information. Therefore, perhaps I could indicate to you the approach I am trying to take, which is I've been asked by many people around the world to put down some of the thoughts that I have that may be help to inform people who have to make decisions today, so to speak, lobby with a different kind of voice than when I was with people like yourself visiting some of the SDF projects and other places around the world. And one of the ideas that seems to me that's revealed is that we have to address this issue of exclusion. And the theme that I want to promote is, how do we bring about inclusion? In fact, you're a person who's used all the different media, including the written media, to get your views out. And that's been very, very helpful. And many people who've observed your efforts would attest to that. I'm trying to follow your example, and I'm starting to do some writing, and the working title will be Inclusion. And it will be built around 3 words that throughout my career, both before I went to the Land Coalition, when I was the director of a Canadian NGO, and since that time when I've been involved in groups that deal with other topics like transparency, corruption, tax justice, the theme is that often we're trying to deal with problems in places other than our home country. And in that case, we have to realize that the change that's going to come about is first and foremost going to require that people from outside try to strengthen the voice of people with inside. In other words, people have to become and be empowered to be the agents of their own development, something that people have heard me say for a long time, and it's not unique, but it gets lost sometimes. And if I write this book, the sub-themes are going to be what you probably heard me say when I had to stand up as the director of ILC, which is, how do we help people in their own communities to gain voice, visibility, and opportunity? These 3 words, to my mind, capture the idea of, we have to start to listen to the people. We have to just start to design things based upon working, which other people might say, from the grassroots up. But that's easy to say. But the issues we're talking about, whether it's distribution of vaccines, which we've just talked a little bit about, or various issues that you've highlighted, is the issue of power. The issue of good intentions is just that. It's good intentions, but we've seen too many good intentions not turn into action and therefore change the power dynamics. We've seen the extent to which we talk about pro-poor growth, pro-poor development. But in most countries, the institutions that make those decisions are controlled by the powerful non-poor. When do we let the people who are going to be affected indicate what needs to be done? And the failure of this is a power issue, but it's also a failure to understand by those people who say they'd like that to happen, that the poor, broadly speaking, know what needs to be done. The issue isn't knowing what needs to be done. The issue is the means to break into the power structure and gain access. This to me is the whole idea of giving voice to people, visibility and opportunity. And this is where organizations that I've worked with, that I've been the director of, including the Land Coalition, we always spoke about what is our role to try to do that. So I would hope you could say that when we provided some, in this case, funding to the Social Development Foundation these 20 plus years ago, we tried hard not to tell you what needed to be done. We tried to say, you know the community, you know what needs to be done, but we realized that you need a bit of support to supplement your own efforts.
Yeah, that's correct, Bruce. But what is happening today is a diametric change. People use very good terms, but the thing is that developmental agenda has been fixed from the top. And when we speak about poor, there is no poor in the planning. As you said, as you mentioned, this is the rich elite capture. So what happens is that, we will always, talk about a lot about democracy, democratization, poor, inclusion. But when the question of planning comes, the whole environment is as such that poor cannot find a space. Suppose we have, people talk about indigenous people talk about Dalit rights, all these things at the international level, and our women's right. So, and I've seen many places where the women's rights are being discussed without women being involved in it. So how do we bring the women from the marginalized to these places? Unless, there is an agency, there is a work, and we encourage them, this will never happen, and it will like from the top down agenda, rather than from the listening to them, as you said, that we have to listen to them and, give them voice and visibility and opportunity.
Yeah, this has been a challenge, and it's something that at times we thought we were making progress on. And once again, I in fact, even though I left my role with the Land Coalition some years ago, I attended a meeting of some of the members of the Land Coalition just about a year and a half ago when I was in Italy for personal reasons, and on behalf of a Ottawa-based NGO that's a member. And at that meeting, I was very sad to hear there were about 20 members of the Land Coalition, largely from the north at that particular meeting. It was a meeting of that subgroup. And the concern I heard was that land rights have been sliding off of the international agenda. I was involved in the formation of the Land Coalition, not because I was the first director, because I was at the meeting where we advocated for the creation of that organization. And so when you talk about the fact that we're back into this long thought understanding that trickle down economics does not work, basically policies are like that. But more important is what is not happening with regard to international agreements. I can remember having about 20 members of the Land Coalition in Johannesburg for the World Summit on Sustainable Development, one of the many summits of the 90s. That resulted in going into the early 2000 period in many international agreements that we felt as social agencies was making progress when governments could say they agreed to the outcome of a conference, but they had to go back and get their governments to ratify these agreements. Well, I told you earlier that I was thinking about maybe doing some writing. So people said, what's the theme going to be? the first theme I had was going to be to call, as a working title of my book, to call it Rights Gone Wrong. Because it seems to me that a major problem that we have is that we have discussed beyond what is necessary the same issues. And when you've been around as long as people like I have been, if there's anything we can say in the interest of encouraging or advocating, is that, you know, we have seen these international agreements negotiated, renegotiated, different sessions for the climate change, etc. And we keep playing around with words. Words don't change people's lives unless they are the basis to get solidarity and action. And in fact, the issue of what needs to be done to solve these things is an issue that governments are not being honest and not acting with integrity because they're not complying with the very agreements, including those which their governments have ratified. So the whole question of the multilateral system falling into question is something that I think is a deserved question. Because unless we can count on these organizations and their membership to hold governments accountable, and instead what we're seeing is if other governments can behave like the United States recently, if you don't have things your own way, you withdraw, as we have seen. But the issue to my mind is about compliance. It's not about knowing what needs to be done. It's not about knowing that it's not sustainable to continue using this economic model. People should read, for example, a very interesting book that I just reread the last few days by Joseph Stiglitz, who was a Nobel Prize winner, called The Price of Inequality. Or they should watch a film of years gone by that has to do with Walmart, that looks at the high cost of low prices. And all of these things bear upon what we're seeing and popularize the understanding that we're in a system that's not working.
But you said about multilateral institutions, and actually I agree with the point that the system is stuck at somewhere. And what I feel from my own experiences in reading about them is that that this multilateral institutions are now actually have become a tool to push the privatization agenda. That is one thing. So they want private entry at all costs from left, right, and they make things that that you have to accept that private corporations are going to be here, and they have to be a part of it. So that is that is coming from the multilateral institution, and that is quite disappointing also. At the same point of time, they refuse to make any new multilateral agenda as a law, as a treaty, but most of these are coming as voluntary guidelines. So what is the use of voluntary guidelines? The states are not ready to comply with them. State will never comply with these guidelines. They will just become a kind of symbol, whether right to food guidelines by FAO, and even now the business and human rights guidelines are coming. So they are all guidelines and they are not implementable.
Yeah, I think that I understand why you say that, and at times my emotions also, not only my mind, but my emotions take me in that direction. However, I've also been around long enough to say that there have been slow progress. The problem is people are being asked to live through several generations of their family for this progress to be made. It's as if these things that we can take the time to get them right, and therefore we renegotiate, as I said before, as opposed to getting on with what needs to be done. And secondly, we end up in a debate that's not unlike the one that you're suggesting needs to be held about what is the role of the private sector, the public sector. My experience has been that where things have worked best is to recognize that those of us whose history, and mine comes from the civil society community like yours does, that civil society-led development without the involvement of good public policy and a good relation with the private sector has not made the progress that we thought it would. but likewise, that the actions by governments with the private sector, unless they mediate and put the boundaries around what the private sector can and cannot do, the way in which it can accumulate assets, the issue currently of working to address the problem of land grabbing would be a very, very dear to us concern. That unless we create the mechanisms for balance, we need all three, in my view. The question is, they are so out of balance that, and the institutions that have control, like the corporate community and the self-interest that we see expressed there, that many people, it's not just Bruce Moore saying this, we hear this in all the literature and the research, that we have to do some rebalancing. And we'll also have to grapple with some underlying measurements. So at the moment, if we look at the economic impact of COVID, and we look at what needs to be done, and we look at what's being said by governments around the world, we still continue to look at well-being using gross domestic product as the indicator. We need to look at the Human Development Index that Amartya Sen and social agencies have pointed out, because we have many countries in the world that also have done really well with improving the well-being, the survival rate of children, et cetera, who have lower GDPs than countries like Canada, the United States, and European countries. And so we also have these various ways in which we look at development and we use these classical economic indicators when we know that trickle-down economics doesn't work. We know many things there are many things that are known but are not known or acted upon by politicians. If I can, for instance, VB, I was criticized at various times in speeches I gave when with the Land Coalition about the inverse relationship between farm size and productivity. And I was criticized because they said there was no supporting evidence. Well, there was supporting evidence by various researchers in the 70s and 80s, and then there was a lag in that. And people were saying I was being naive to think that we could address food security issues through the role of small farmers. Yeah. And if you look in the literature today, people will find an abundance of information that is showing that per unit of land, smallholders produce more food than agribusiness. It doesn't mean that this is all about one or the other, but it is about the fact that if, as the Food and Agriculture Organization points out, that we have to grow more food. If we think about a growing global population, we're going to have to grow more food on currently available arable land. Well, why would we not therefore ask ourselves, if small farmers can produce more food per unit of land, what is the problem? And if there's a problem, it may be that we are failing to recognize that, and therefore, why don't we use the subsidies that go to agribusiness to improve infrastructure, to improve marketing facilities, to improve storage so we avoid post-harvest losses, so on and so forth, so that we can actually capture that improved production and put it into the society and contribute to the food security of those people who, because they were pushed off their land, are living in the slums of Delhi and other places. And this relates to another fundamental point that I think we have to think about, and that is the concept of asset-based community development. Asset-based community development. People, in some ways, security of land will give people an asset that they will invest in. They will invest in it because they know they won't be taken off of the land as soon as they use their labor of their family to improve its productivity. So it's worth investing in it. And therefore they will, perhaps in the short term, they might decide to use that to start a small business as long as it's convertible. Or they might, for the next generation, make sure their kids get an education and have some assets that if they do go to the city, they don't go without the skills in order to be able to find work. So we have to understand that people need assets. And if you start that all you have is your family labor and you don't even have security of your 1 or 2 hectares of land, your chances are pretty grim. So that's where the idea of opportunity comes.
Yeah, I agree with absolutely with that point, Bruce. We have seen that experiment in India. We have worked with communities, and the communities which have a small piece of land are much more independent and can produce for themselves. I come back to your question about the large farmers or large the corporations that are coming up. See, personally, I never have been, against these, one or that, because I know that it's a global world. Everybody has to survive. What is the problem is that, like a country like India, where 70% of its population is dependent on agriculture, and agriculture is not, it's a way of life also. It's a culture. It's a, people depend, people love their, land, and they can produce the food as per their choice. Now, when the corporation become, dominant, it's an attempt to, create monoculture, the food monoculture. And the food monoculture is dangerous. Like if as a Canadian, you come to India, I would like you to drink our local drink, our local, there are a lot of lassis and everything. I don't want you to have the Coke and Pepsi. So what is the use of traveling to wider part of the world when you have having the popcorn, the cornflakes, the same kind of soft drinks, drinking in whether you are in Canada or you giving to Latin America. So it's also the question of the food diversity and food sovereignty. And what the corporations are doing is this. The second thing is that let them do whatever they want to do for the middle classes, for the upper echelon of society. But what is happening is that they're trying to demolish the livelihood of the others, the livelihood of the farmers, and then remain unaccountable when you create monopoly, because it's not multiple corporations, it is just few, very few. Whether you have Kellogg in America or Walmart, and in India we have big companies coming up, Reliance or Adani's or Ambani's, whatever, they are monopolizing the whole thing. So when in India, 20 years back, when our government started so-called liberalization process, those who were for liberalization of economy, they said government should not promote monopolies. So they were blaming the government sector, the public sector, because they say, oh, public sector is being, monopoly, government is, promoting them, and they must be dismantled, and there should be a equal playing field. Now, these corporations are creating monopolies. So a big corporation in India is producing aircraft also, and is also selling the wheat and rice. So they have everything at one shop. So you can go to a mall owned by a big company, and this mall will have the big, you can sell anything. So where will be the poor, the street vendor who depends, who the government has never fulfilled as per its obligation, who are on their own? Where will they do? The second thing is, the second question is more important, why I called for accountability on to international obligation. Nearly 20 years back, more than 20 years back in 1984, so it's not 20 years, actually nearly 26, something like this. The Union Carbide accident in Bhopal, in India, where the owned by the Dow Chemical now, it killed nearly 3,000 people because of the explosion in the methyl isocyanate gas. Nothing happened. Those people are still suffering. The generations have been destroyed. The Union Carbide head, Warren Anderson, was in India, and the government ensured that he leave India without any problem, because the American lobby, the power, the government ensured that he is not touched by the Indian investigating agencies. He left, nothing happened. So how to make these corporations? whether they do work or no work, they have to be made accountable. And there has to be an international mechanism for that. A voluntary guidelines will not work on that.
Well, I think that I think there are positives and negatives about the use of voluntary guidelines. Some of the reports of the rapporteurs have had some effect. It's limited, as you suggest. But with all respect to what you're saying, because I don't disagree with you, the issue for me is we have to decide where we can best use our efforts. And while we need to speak out on these things and we need to give voice to communities to speak out so that their voice is being heard, we need to be in solidarity when attending global meetings. On the other hand, we also have to look at the issue that we don't end up behaving as social agencies the way that the opposition in Parliament often behaves, which is we're good at saying what we don't like and what other people should do. But I believe that at the moment we are getting there's a growing concern that the economic models that we've somewhat talked about are not working. What we have to do is start to get our voice out about what is the alternative, because that's where we have the greatest legitimacy. Social agencies, organizations, I would say, that are hybrids, like the Land Coalition, are a bit further along than others in having relations at the community level to talk about their topic of land rights. And we have to help people to understand some of the basic concepts, because otherwise people are going to say, yes, we have to bring about change, but what are we going to try to put into its place? And if we don't help people to understand that people are leaving rural communities and going to the cities because of lack of choice, because of land grabbing, if we don't help people to understand that what's being put out by global organizations is about growing urbanization, when in fact, at the present time, we have almost an equal proportion of the world's population in rural communities and urban communities, slightly more now in global, if you put the global numbers together, in cities, but we're talking almost half of the world's population in rural communities. Unless we start to take up these questions about land rights so people can form family assets, people can start to build rural communities so the income that's generated doesn't just mean a transaction between the city and the countryside, but you start to develop small businesses, processing of food, value added. And I've seen that during the war in El Salvador. My organization, my NGO, the Canadian Hunger Foundation, we worked with communities to help them to add value to their products that they were selling into the United States, and that made a tremendous difference. So the concepts that surround the role of rural development, to break down the bias in terms of tax incentives, the issues of corruption that are allowing some of these things to go on, and understanding that we're going to have a more massive problem, and we're also going to be very morally inappropriate if we don't support people where they live. And there's still almost half the world lives in rural communities. If we don't start to have people understand that when we argue for land, and this is not because I was a director of the Land Coalition, because my life, I've realized long before I went to the Land Coalition, and more so when I was there, that land is not one of many topics. Yes, people need health. Yes, people need education. Yes, people, and the list goes on. But land has been put in that list, when in fact, the evidence is clear. If people have security of land, they invest in looking after it. They build family assets. They look after the land, and otherwise, what has happened worldwide? People slash and burn the current land and move on to the next piece of land, because why invest in that land if somebody's going to take it away from you? So this means that security of land creates a way to address natural resource management, climate change. We're not cutting down as much forests. Why don't they realize, as in India, where before in the 80s, my NGO worked with 60 non-governmental groups to introduce biogas. And biogas has a major effect on the environment where it works, because instead of cutting down the forest, you have your energy. Instead of burning up your cow dung, you instead get the benefit out of the biogas from processing that animal waste, and then you still have a slurry to put on the ground. These are rather fundamental concepts, but they're not understood. And one of the roles we can play is to point out that democracy, for example, has grown better in countries where people have security of land, because then you're an important player. This idea that I start to call it, this is about the politics of place. Until people have a place that's their own, that they can defend, that they can sell, that they can be taxed on, then people don't have a role to play. If we look at land and we look at, I'd be happy to share with your listeners a paper that was published a few years ago, looking at the role of land in peace and security issues. If we look at conflict in the world, people are competing, whether it's the Israelis competing to take over territory of the Palestinians, or the Russians moving into other places in order to distract their population from the current issues and the idea of they're becoming a big power again. In the end, we know that conflict is directly related to a certain percentage, I don't want to overstate it, on lack of security of land tenure. So that I think that when I say that you're quite correct that we have to fight the global model of the way the economy and politics is being shaped by those who have elite power. On the other hand, we have to show people that there's an alternative, of which some of these are part of the concepts that we have to do a better job of educating people. I would consider a lot of my friends and people I've been involved on I've been on the board of, since leaving Rome, on the board of Transparency International, the Foundation for Democratic Global Governments, the Tax Justice Organization. I've been a representative at the Civil 20 meetings of the G20 in many countries, Moscow, Istanbul, etc. When we talk about the issues of the fundamental role of rural communities, then we can explain it in ways I've tried to mention in this interview. Some people are surprised. The idea of the inverse relationship between farm size and productivity, people say, well, how can that be? Don't they just produce only for themselves? Isn't it just subsistence agriculture? Well, it will remain subsistence if we don't invest in the other supportive infrastructure that makes it a contribution to the economy and to their family incomes. So I think that we have a responsibility not just to advocate for changing the global system, but more so our strength and our legitimacy will be to say to people, we can change the global system to be more like this, which will make more inclusive growth and more inclusive development.
I agree with your point, and actually we have to work on a multiple level, but yes, the work starts at the ground level, and as you said, and I had been speaking on this issue that land reforms are meant for democratization of society, because coming from a society which is feudal in nature, which is casteist, where the dominant caste have the big land holding and the marginalized don't have, and they suffer. The whole caste system is inflicted. It has an economic bias. It is a social basis, a cultural foundation, but an economic bias, and that is why land reforms are more than necessary for a country like India or Nepal or Bangladesh, wherever this caste system operate, and that operate in a very and many people in the Western world don't even understand that, because they realize that it's like a layered, different caste, each caste considering itself above the others. So, yes. So definitely, as your point of view, I agree with this point. And as I said, in that we have seen such cases where the people who have land, they have better, autonomy of themselves. Those who don't, like most of the cases of hunger in India, the hunger deaths in India. And I can say that as a person working on the hunger issues for the last 25 years, I started coming to land because I felt that fighting hunger is not possible without, the equitable distribution of land. And there where I found that most of the communities suffering from hunger are those who are absolutely landless, absolutely landless.
Yes, and when we get into that, the other is that for those of us concerned about these issues, we need to also align ourselves, because with those organizations concerned about decent conditions of work for agriculture workers,
Yes,
because we do know that if
absolutely.
we look at the number of landless in the world, it's a deplorable number that people are left with for reasons you've said. But also, if we look at the conditions of agriculture workers, and
Yes,
it's a fair argument, and I've been part of it at many international debates, to say that even if people had security of land, one is if they haven't been on the land for a long time because they've been an agriculture worker, to return to the land could be a little bit of a misplaced idea, because if you've had a part of a generation of not working the land, learning of everything, then if you're going to try to learn how to deal with access to credits, such as some of the microcredit programs, or how to process and market, there's a lot to be learned. And so for some people, the issue of the rural community is to create favorable conditions for agriculture workers. But sometimes these can be, if we look at some of the experiences, such as in the Philippines, where you have people who had been farm laborers on sugar plantations. There, when land was distributed under the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, which had major problems, but we won't go into what they were at this time. But in many ways, they wisely said, we cannot divide this sugar land up into individual plots, expecting that every farm worker will know how to deal with that. So they set it up as a cooperative,
yeah,
but everybody had title to their little part of the land, so that if they needed to use it for collateral, or at some point they needed to convert it, they owned that part, but they operated collectively. Well, that relates to the problem of people who are actual agriculture workers. We need to deal with the larger agricultural companies, the agri-food companies, because they're not going to go away.
yeah,
But we do. So if we only think about the landless,
yeah,
then we're failing those people who are poor, that are working the land, and their kids are
yeah,
going to bed hungry. So we have to deal, and there are international social organizations that we in the land that are concerned with land rights need to align with the farm workers organizations at the same time. We need to look at the overseas workers. There's a massive problem in Canada right now we've had over 20 years of Caribbean and Central Americans coming to Canada to do harvesting and in Canada. And when we go back to where we started this interview, talking about the pandemic, the number of these people who are in, so to speak, bunk houses under unacceptable conditions, for which the pandemic of COVID is spreading rapidly, we have to address the question of what's happening on these farms, including in my own country, Canada, with overseas workers who come in on a seasonal basis to do jobs Canadians don't want to do. So I think we need to form relations with all of these groups, or at least we need to find ways to help them get support. Not everybody can work together.
yeah.
We're all busy people, but we need to recognize and build solidarity so that the voice within our societies, we make it stronger.
Yeah, I agree with it, but it's like again this question coming up with the authoritarianism and nationalism building up in our society. Speaking about the rights of the people is becoming like you are anti-national. So if you are talking about land rights, if you ask land reform, the government don't want to listen. They're not keen that we speak about that. They want to compensate it with the they say that this developmental, the charitable approach, like we can give something to poor, 5 kilogram of ration or 10 kilogram of rice, but they don't want to speak about the land and the land reform. So, and all those who are fighting or speaking about it. So one side, we are talking about land reform. The other side, whatever land the poor had is being snatched from them in the name of development. So
Yeah.
more land has been acquired by the government than given to the poor. So how? This is where the whole issue of corporations come, because the same government, open-heartedly welcoming please investors come, we have enough land for you. So that is the, how do we fight this? Because if we speak about these issues, then we are termed as, as differently, a lot of cases filed against people or fighting, speaking for them. But this is not merely in India. In every part of the world, particularly all the developing countries, the authoritarian regimes are doing that kind of thing.
Yes. Well, before we leave, and I'm sorry, I'll have to be on my way, but I think that we've got an issue here. You and I have discussed in your country, but it's been in mine and other countries, which has been that it's a funny situation, VB. On the one hand, we feel our voice is not being heard as a voice with and in partnership with local communities. Yet on the other hand, when we raise our voice, increasingly governments are saying we cannot receive funding from outside. In your country, for a long, long time, at least as long as we've known each other and maybe longer, government has put controls upon support that comes from, let's say, NGOs in other countries or of any form. And that's not unique. We've had cases where civil society groups have been aligned with Indigenous people in Western Canada, and we're getting support from some organizations in the United States, and our government cut that off, saying the same thing that's said about your organization and other groups in India, which is you're getting funding from terrorist organizations abroad. They're fomenting terrorism and things of this nature. So they're trying to discredit the very voice that I'm talking about, voice and visibility, that organizations like yours give to local communities, so that decision makers, who we hope will be more responsible, will listen to what they have to say. Well, the reality is, because of the economics, your group, just like the Indigenous people in Western Canada, cannot afford what's involved in doing some of this lobbying. Lobbying is not something that can be done without some level of infusion of cash. And so the discrediting of social society, civil society, is growing worldwide. And the very voice that we want to give and visibility to the role of social agencies to balance the public sector and the private sector we're really having quite a battle. The literature, as you probably read it, about the challenges to social organizations globally is something that we need to use our global civil society networks in order to try to defend our position. And exactly what form that will take, I don't know. I'd have thoughts, of course, but clearly the very structures that we've respected and tried to respect, that yes, there's going to be agribusiness as long as we make sure that's not at the expense of smallholder farmers. Yes, there's going to be, but there has to be balance, and the corruption and the unfair political voice that these groups get has to change. But if there's efforts being made that doesn't allow us as global civil society to work together, because we're being discredited by some governments as being agents of other governments or agents that are spreading corruption, terrorism, then we have a big task in front of ourselves as well.
So, Bruce, this has been a very tiring journey, tiring or inspiring both ways. And what inspired you to come to join this developmental sector? You might have many other options also.
That's always something that's hard to say, but it's the idea that without other people helping to create opportunity, maybe my idea of that development is not about what people will decide to do, it's to have the choice, the opportunity to advance their own interests. I happen to have come from an industrial city in Canada called Hamilton. It was a steel town. My father died when I was a young boy. My mother was from a very large family. She was not sent to school. She looked after aging parents, a scenario that exists in so much of the world. when my father passed away at a very young age, could not afford insurance. So my mother had to figure out how to raise us. And not having much education was very difficult for her to get work. But other people provided opportunities for my sister and I. Sometimes they provided what we today could call food aid. An uncle sent a food basket every week. She had, as I imply, she had 7 brothers and sisters. And so she was the youngest. The other brothers and sisters had their children went to work in industry. They told my mother when I became a teenager that I should also get a job in the steel mills. And my mother said, this is not what I want for my children. Don't tell me what I should do. I'll work it out. And I've got some outside help. So it ended up that through the help of others, I became the first in that generation to be able to go to university, but it came from the poorest within that family. And it was because other people, other groups provided support to my mother and then to me. So the idea that if we want to bring about change, and my life was much changed from what it would have otherwise been, if people had provided some opportunities, and my mother took advantage of those to raise her children. So in many ways, that's a rather personal story I'm telling that I don't tell very often, but that sort of started me as a young man thinking that development and is about opportunity and choices. I was given those choices, so I was inspired. And then I looked around and I became a street worker in downtown Toronto, a little bit older, working with people in disadvantaged situations, and eventually had the chance to get involved as a volunteer with some groups that worked internationally. One thing led to another, and that developed the course of my life.
Oh, great. So you started as a volunteer working with the street elder people.
I worked with as a street worker with young people in the downtown area of Toronto, and then I worked was offered a job to work with the international programs, in this case of the YMCA for the 4 Atlantic provinces. Then I became the director of a Canadian NGO that worked with farmer organizations. We had partnerships in about 20 countries, including your own, where my earlier reference to supporting from IFAD to chair their NGO Advisory Committee. And after that became involved in the Conference on Hunger and Poverty that led to the formation of the Land Coalition. So things sort of happened, like this interview. It was rather not planned. It sort of happened. Opportunities came along, and I was fortunate to be able to be involved in part of that.
And you were ready to take a daring decision about your life, because coming from Canada to Rome might have been a big decision.
Well, it was more the thing that a lot of decisions, as many people who are probably listening to this who have children, was to say, is it the time to leave? Because we had aging parents, we had children off at university. Did we want to go off and live in Rome? It was an issue that in families is, how does that affect your partner? So there was the issue of, would we take a longer term commitment, which we were asked to take, and we had to say no. We take an initial short-term commitment to work at the Land Coalition, because it depended also on my wife Anne being able to continue her career, which she was able to do. So a lot of these decisions, if we cut through them, as I've tried to expose in terms of why did I do this and what decisions did we make, we made these as family decisions. It was very important to discuss with parents and to discuss with our children and to discuss with my wife whether it was appropriate to take this. It was obviously career-wise a great invitation to be invited to take on this work with the Land Coalition. but it didn't mean because it was great for me that it was great for everybody that I love.
That's very fair analysis. What keep you going in this depressing scenario in today's time? You are as energetic as I saw you, say 5 months back or 20 years back. What is the source of your energy?
I guess it's that's hard to say. But it's also hard to let it go. These things have not gone away, and in fact, in many ways, the recent time, the rise of the populist efforts around the world, the way in which the geopolitics is changing. We have organizations in the world that were not active back in the formation of many of the international agreements. And as much as there's reason to be lobbying hard, as we've talked about, for compliance with agreements, also some of the big actors were not there. And so they're, of course, using that to say, well, some of these international agreements don't apply to us because we weren't at the table when the UN established them. So in many ways, what keeps you going is that the values behind this, the values of people like yourself and people I keep in touch with that became friends, these aren't jobs that we do. These are relationships that we work on. And to see what people like yourself and others are struggling with, when we thought we had seen some of these things put behind us, they're now back on the surface. And so therefore, it's hard to not sort of say, if there's anything about what I've done in the past that can be helpful to people having to face these terrible challenges of trying to change international structures today, it's something that gets a little bit under your skin. You can't let go of it. And so I guess that's what keeps me going. Speaking from the basis that I've spoken, is that there is a difference eventually, because it's hard to keep up to all the current information. That's where we count upon the people who listen to interviews such as this. But perhaps there are some lessons from the past that need to be reminded, and I've tried to share a few of those in this interview. So I hope people find that useful.
What is the thing immediately in your mind which you have not done and you want to do it?
Well, the thing that I've not done is I can't really say that there's something that I have not done, other than the idea of putting some of this on paper is something. I've been much more of a person to work directly with communities. So the idea of putting pen to paper is not the same as being at the table, negotiating and things like that. So the challenge for me is to do that. And people who are good at doing that, like you, will be called upon to assist me. But no, I've been very, very fortunate and continue to receive invitations such as this, and would be happy to speak individually to any groups who found this useful if they wanted to go into any of the things I've mentioned in more detail.
So thank you very much, Bruce, for sparing your time, and wish you a lot of strength and happiness and success in your future endeavors.
Thank you, VB. And I hope that I can look in upon some of the groups that will be following your work and the work that you inspire around the world, to see that you can find the courage to stand up to the institutions that need to be challenged. Thank you. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure speaking to you, Bruce.